Thanks for answering my questions
So,
about,
we had that conversation, because this went back with Travis, I think he wanted to test everything.
I know.
So
Okay.
I was like, every bathroom sink and stuff, and I'm just like, there's no cups there for them to use, and health department concurs, they go, you're getting everything you need to get.
My older daughter is going to go there next year, and I got an email about the math, like
So, yeah.
working thing over the summertime, and like,
I don't think that she.
I just- it would have been helpful if I got like earlier.
I need a bunch of notes.
Oh.
My
I'll
husband
have
can
some
work
time.
for the
Do you want me to like send these over electronically so somebody doesn't have to like
Yes.
type them again?
You don't mind, that would be
Seeing
great.
that
But yeah,
That's-
you could make yes and, like if you have copies that I can take, that's great.
I mean, I can give you this,
Oh,
but
yeah.
then you're just gonna be to get it in again anyway, I can just send you the.
That sounds perfect, yeah. No, thank you for doing
I
that.
finally had time to
It's not really quantifiable.
spend more
Digest it all,
time
yeah.
looking at things.
It's just like to help.
I had some of my own ideas.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it.
No, it was.
All right, John. Thank you all for coming. I mentioned briefly just that we had a handful of folks who weren't able to make it tonight and let us know. So they shared their sorries and are gonna plan to watch the recording and everything and keep up. So yeah, happy to have you all here. A lot to get through. We have a little more active sort of engagement activity today, which I think will be fun, at least in my opinion, which I know is subjective, but yeah. So before we jump in, I want to give my colleague Nazra a chance to introduce herself, who's joining us tonight.
Hi everyone, my name is Nazra. I am an architect specializing in schools. I'm based in our New York office, and I've been working. I worked on this project mostly a lot more last year, but I'm back and
Thanks, Nazar. Yeah, you may have met Nazar at some of the town halls that we did last year. But yeah, happy to have her back in the room, especially as we talk about facilities, given her expertise. So with that, we can jump right in. So similar agenda structure, trying to keep it as brief as possible so that we can get into the small group work. But just to touch quickly on the sort of administrative items, additional materials. So in front of you, you've got, or if you grab them on your way in, the facilities one pager, which has on just a note to it, the supplementary resources. If you look at the digital version, it does have administrative policies related to facilities, as well as the state statute that has details on what the requirements are for dispossessing buildings and what MPS sort of can and cannot do in that realm. So hopefully that's helpful context. And then just some other items that we've added to the Google Drive. The data, the spreadsheet you have in front of you is that exploration tool where you can search by school and look at that. That is all the data for all the schools. The digital version is also in your Google Drive folder if you want to manipulate that, but that has a ton of information on it. So hopefully it's not too small to read. And then we've also added the utility report if you want to see which buildings are more demanding from a utility perspective than others in the district, as context on that. And then the budget preparation guide as well, which is something that Nick Sinram had shared in the earlier meeting, I think back in March, about how it's like a 17-page document about how principals prepare their school budget. So there's a lot of content if you want to get into it, please have at. From there, we wanted to just touch on just what we've heard in the last month in the Community Insights Forum. So we have had a lighter response from Southwest, only a couple of responses of the 30 plus, I think 32 or so. And just a lot of the comments that we did get were similar. So we kind of grouped them all together as opposed to having them broken out by region. You'll see when we get to, if you had a chance to look at the presentation ahead of time, the district versus region analysis, we've shared all the regions. We realized that looking at one region in isolation isn't necessarily super informative. So just in terms of topics or factors that people had brought up, prioritizing resource consolidation and allocation through this process, being transparent with metrics, school start times, it came up a lot as it related to transportation and the impact that that has. And then questions, so these are these questions that are there every month as people are asking details about right sizing be finalized and shared with the public. and then equitable access to athletic facilities. So I want to just pause for a second and, something that came up yesterday is just kind of re-grounding ourselves, and we'll get into this more in the next meeting, but in kind of the why. And, reminding folks like this process, what we're working towards. So, when we started a year ago, it was really just to try to, set up, what is the vision for the district from like a student support and academic standpoint? How would the buildings need to support that? And then evaluating how they currently are supporting that and sort of what changes would need to be made. So that's kind of the basis of this project. We want to align with district goals for students. And we know that the new superintendent, has really hit the ground running with trying to make sure that those goals are still sort of aligned with everything. So as we move through this process, I think it's a really great opportunity for us to make sure that we are, our goal has been to get everybody here up to speed, right? Like kind of make sure that we have a wider community group and we're just working in a small, project team to have everybody be on the same page. And so as we move forward, going into the next month's meeting, just a little bit of a look ahead, we're going to start talking about more like strategy options that are out there, what other districts are doing, what applies to MPS, and what we should be considering as we look at that data and schools that might be well qualified for certain strategies, which those last couple of columns on the spreadsheet you'll see are those initial strategy candidate group rankings. So just wanting to speak to the fact that, we'll have more specific and like prepared content in the next month's meeting, just in terms of kind of where we're at in the process and how we see the next handful of meetings unfolding and where we'd like to go. But wanted to take a second to speak to that. Any questions related to goals or MPS team, anything you would add to that? Okay, great. The last question on the page here is just, so we have those rotating questions each month, excuse me. This one was the question about specialty programs. So we heard a lot about expanding certain programs. Montessori was mentioned a lot, arts, as well as AP and tutoring. And then some of the conversations that we had heard in the meetings as well, just about trying to work in certain specialty programs like world languages into more non-specialty schools, try to improve access and sort of improve those non-specialty schools in terms of what they have to offer. What was interesting on the transportation front, so if you look at the top chart here, the question was how important is MPS transportation when choosing a school, and it's pretty balanced. The blue is very important, the red is somewhat important, and the orange is not important. So about 12 of the 29 people said very important. What's interesting is in the second one, and again, this is a small sample size, 29 people obviously, but if your child's school stopped offering busing, what would you most likely do? And 82%, I think this was 24 or 25 people, said that they would keep their child at that school and find a like MPS provided mode of transportation to get their kids there, which, I guess was, it's a strong response in one direction. And I think there was a lot more back and forth in the last meeting. So an interesting data point that we might want to look into further as we start to talk about, policy considerations and everything. So, hopefully everybody had a chance to look at the facilities landscape analysis. I won't go through each page word for word, but just speaking to age of MPS school buildings, older buildings, 82 years on average. When you look at the national average, that is about 50 years. So also old, a lot of which have not received much, a significant amount of renovation, replacement, or even upgrading work in the last 15 years. Please stop me at any point too if there's anything we want to clarify. Air conditioning is one, so just digging into specific conditions and sort of components of buildings. Air conditioning is one that we know is always top of mind. While over half of MPS school buildings have some degree of air conditioning, only 26% of all the classrooms are actually air conditioned across the district. What we did from there is just digging into sort of what's expected from a climate perspective. We know this chart is a little difficult to read, so our sustainability team in-house had put this together. But what you're seeing here is just the calendar year from left to right going across. And so these middle months are the summer months, and that's showing in the year 2025 right now. This is Milwaukee specific, just like the amount of heat stress that exists in those summer months. And you can see that it's increasing as the years go on. And then on the bottom chart is just the thermal comfort stress point. So to keep a building comfortable, in the red is like how much cooling is necessary. You can see there's more and more heat stress, meaning more and more air conditioning would be required. Now, these are the summer months, but you can see it starts to really spread out down there. So we just know that that is a problem that is likely to continue to grow in terms of, or a challenge that will grow as time passes. From there, we just wanted to highlight, that this is a widespread issue. A lot of districts across the US are facing these challenges, and this is even just in the last 4 years. All the counties in orange are ones that are projected to fall into this category of need based on 32 plus school days of the year at 80 degrees or higher of an outdoor air temperature.
I've got a question,
Fire away.
and maybe it's a Michelle question.
Sure.
What percentage of the classrooms during the summer ones are used for educational purposes?
What percentage of the classroom?
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's what it's the hottest, and we're gonna talk air conditioning.
Yeah, I'm gonna say most of our summer schools tend to use around 10 classrooms, and say there's 10 sites, so that'd be like 100 classrooms.
In total?
And then we have camp programs also going on a lot of schools, so there's probably about 25 or more camp programs, and let's say they each use anywhere from 5 to 10 rooms, so it's quite a few. It's quite a few, but it's spread out across the city.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. All right. So another key component of facilities obviously is accessibility, ADA access. So what we're looking at here specifically, which buildings are wheelchair accessible. And you have about 8 out of 10 MPS buildings are there. And when you look at the elementaries and K-8s, obviously there's a far greater amount of those schools. So it is a lower percentage that are meeting that mark. Nationally, we know this is a challenge when you're talking about older buildings. When new buildings are constructed, they're required, code requirements to be accessible. But this just kind of shows the challenges that exist even just in approaching a school. So the GAO surveyed schools across 6 states, and these words, the sort of percentages of schools that had challenges in that regard. And if you look at the bottom bullet there, about 1 out of every 5 districts in the US has at least one school where students may not be able to attend due to accessibility issues. So certainly a widespread challenge. Safety and security is another one that we know is always top of mind. So this chart is just showing, all the different safety considerations that buildings can take into that schools are doing from a physical standpoint, and how they've changed over, a 10-year period. So seeing some jump up. It's worth noting that on this one, classrooms with door locks wasn't surveyed in 2009, which is why it jumps or appears to jump from 0 to like 65. But yeah, so in addition to physical security, it's also important to consider what's going on inside the building. We know that striking that balance is really important. So it's easy to think about the importance of lockdowns and, having that building, but also not wanting to create a bunker of the school, and understanding the importance of being able to see within classrooms and make sure that everything going on behind closed doors is, can be supervised as well. So at the top of the list from, the CDC's survey, from student risk behavior, youth risk behavior, bullying and mental health issues were far higher reported than weapons, which is at the lower end here. But really, we just want to highlight that it is a balance, and, something that this is actually research that our firm has done, and just trying to strike that balance from a school design standpoint of safe, but also welcoming. From there, going into light exposure risk. So we know there's a lot of information out there on this. Didn't want to sort of inundate with additional sort of details, but just high level, showing the 9 schools that have been identified with actionable levels, which have been temporarily closed, some of which have already reopened. And then the lead action plan that calls for schools to be inspected and remediated before the start of the school year and the calendar year. So plenty of information there online. Also, just to highlight, like, all these links in the corner should be active. So as you look through it, if you ever want to see where this data came from or read any of these articles, you should be able to access it right there. And then when we're talking about lead, it's important to know that this is not solely connected to MPS, and is a larger issue in the city at large. So knowing that 90% of residential homes in Milwaukee were built before 1978, meaning they have a decent likelihood of containing lead paint. And that rental units, approximately 200,000 likely contain lead paint, and that the cost to remove that lead paint would be $50,000 per unit. So a staggering cost to try to, address that challenge. There had been a decent amount of money that had been sort of earmarked federally to address specifically residential lead in low-income communities. That funding is set to run out at the end of the next calendar year, and then return to lower levels. So nationwide, there are other school districts dealing with this. The Journal Sentinel recently had a story that sort of highlighted some of the challenges in Chicago and New York and Philadelphia. New York is obviously at a much larger scale, so the numbers are different relatively speaking, but they've been dealing with this issue for a long time. A couple summers ago, Chicago was also trying to take action on some of their schools that have lead. Yeah.
So it was 50,000 per apartment unit.
Correct.
How much is it for an actual MPS school?
I think that would depend heavily on square footage, and that's the thing, like abatement of that nature is talking about like removing the lead paint, whereas another acceptable form of abatement is encapsulation, which is just basically making sure that it's painted over, that it is not at risk of being consumed. Once it starts chipping away and dusting, that's when it becomes dangerous. So yeah, it really is everywhere in these older buildings, and so it's really a matter of maintaining it. So last but not least, I think this is the most telling graph if you didn't have a chance to look at it, but a survey by the GAO in 2017, just asking school districts about what they were doing about lead. So 88% when you combine these bottom two numbers of school districts either weren't testing for lead or didn't know if they were in that school year. Only 12% did, and of those 12%, about half of them found lead in at least some of their buildings. And then only 6% of the schools surveyed actually had a recurring plan for inspecting lead. So it's something that is likely a challenge in many, if not most. They were only surveying districts that had buildings before 1978 too. So these are all candidates for districts that could have lead challenges. Sort of bringing that back to the why, right? Like, why does all this stuff matter, especially as we're talking about student outcomes and supporting student success? There's a ton of good research and information on the impacts of facilities on student outcomes. So these are just three that seemed relevant, and we know are a little biased on the last one. This is a report that our firm actually put out. We did a large effort with the Drexel School of Education and Baltimore City Public Schools and DC Public Schools, and the impact of a modernized school, sort of the outcomes compared to non-modernized schools, and how that differed from student outcomes, community engagement, a whole host of metrics. Then you have Harvard School of Public Health put out a meta-analysis of healthy buildings and sort of how those impact kids and students. And then that top one is actually Milwaukee specific. So it's a little older, 2001, but just identifying the correlations between student test scores and facility quality. So all those links are down there if you want to access any of those reports, but really interesting stuff. MPS revenue, so just highlighting, knowing that MPS revenue comes from state, local taxes, et cetera, federal funding. MPS does get about $1 out of every $5 from federal funding, so a high amount, given the sort of turbulence with the Fed too. It's an important consideration. And even though they're not at the top of this list, when you consider scale, they're definitely taking the most money from federal assistance, just given the size of the district. I won't go through this line by line, but this is just pulled from the MPS budget, showing kind of how the money is divided up in the $1.5 billion budget for this year. And then this is one that we really did want to highlight, is just comparatively speaking, in terms of the percentages of MPS budget is spent on what. So operations and maintenance, those ongoing costs for maintaining buildings. MPS is below the state average, which is yellow, national average, which is green. Significantly lower than the average there, but really we're going to draw attention as capital expenditures. So the capital funding is just significantly lower than MPS historically. And that number does ebb and flow over time, which is important to note, but not to a great degree. So I do think this is pretty representative and just showing some of the challenges when you think about how old the building stock is here, and the challenges that the district is facing on that front.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
So for capital expenditures, is that, so that would be like any kind of, improvements to the building, so.
Like major renovations.
Converting classrooms, things like that, right? Does the national numbers or the state numbers factor in construction referendums? With the explosion of referendum money
Yes.
across, so,
So,
I mean, like, is that a
Are- oh, are
possible
you
factor
saying-
in here, like, because NPS has not had a capital referendum?
right,
It's
and
not
that's,
like, it's purely operational.
right,
Whereas the rest of the state, everyone's been building brand new high schools and middle schools and stuff like that. If that's part of what's going on with those numbers.
Well, and it's
What's
also-
relevant.
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. So these are 2022 numbers as well. And I believe those, like, you know, if a referendum passes, that's gonna be baked into their budget, so that would be reflected there. But I think that's also to highlight just, you know, the amount of funding that is being pursued and factored in as part of the sort of overall pot. But yeah, it's a good question, and then this next slide does touch on like capital funding nationwide and just a lot of states, so all but, or at least there are 12 states that do not. There are a few states that didn't respond, but 12 states that definitively do not provide capital funding support for school districts within the state, Wisconsin being one of them. And so sort of leaving it up to local pursuit by the district. You know, when states do support it, there are, you know, state education agency initiatives and guidelines that are sort of worked into that. And then last but not least, just sort of a bond patterns and projections. So with ESSER funding winding down, which if you're not familiar, ESSER funding is that federal funding that came out to respond to COVID. So trying to, you know, which could be used in a myriad of ways, whether it be staffing or facility improvements or anything that was COVID related, which is a broad, like a big umbrella. But as that sort of wound down, you can see these numbers going up. So the amount of money that's being pursued in a school bond fashion. So school bonds being specifically related to capital expenditures, whereas like a bond is a referendum, but not all referendums are bonds. So the last two referendums MPS has done have been operational, whereas these are capital, so CapEx dollars. And then just as you mentioned, you know, in this last election in April, 31 school bonds were pursued and 21 were passed. And I don't have the numbers from November, but that is from April, and then the last NPS school bond attempt was in 1993, 366 million, which is 815 million in today dollars, and was soundly rejected with 75% of the vote that came in being against. So just kind of painting some backstory as to how we got here, right? Like how MPS has landed where they are. And then jumping into the district versus regional analysis. Any questions on the previous part before we move on? Great. So as we said, we just didn't want to show everything in isolation. So trying to show, you know, different regions within the district. You can see the sort of legend here of different colors, but these are just original construction year. So the decades that schools were built, you can see obviously majority of them were significantly older, and then you had the spike in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s as well. We also wanted to note when additions were sort of happening. So there are limitations to what this graph is showing in the sense that not all additions are the same. One could be small, one could be very large, and this is just quantity. But we wanted to at least give the picture of kind of when those were happening, and some of them obviously still are. And this is just the number of additions by region. So in the Southwest, there have been 30 additions in sort of the history of MPS. So going on from there, looking at facility condition index rating. So FCI, if you're not familiar, is just dividing deferred maintenance costs over the replacement value of the building. It is worth pointing out the limitations of these comparisons as well. The idea is to try to, you know, sort of evaluate the health of the building, but it is not always apples to apples. If you're looking at the FCI of a building that has an HVAC system and has, you know, air conditioning, that is going to have a much, you know, that's a huge dollar amount. So if it's worked into that deferred maintenance costs, and, you know, it can really be more of an apples to oranges comparison. Yeah.
As far as like deferred maintenance,
Mhm.
I don't think, how to say it? I'm not sure that the numbers that MPS has are, we should really hang our hat on, because there were numerous things. I'm assuming that's coming out of the cyclic maintenance budget, which left, it didn't have like testing and balancing. It did not have any asbestos abatement. It obviously will not have lead abatement. So, and that was created I think when I started back in the 90s, by some foreman sitting at his desk, putting numbers down going, I think it's this. I don't know how accurate that is, so.
We actually, we have been actually inflating and working with those numbers, so.
But they were bad to start with, adding inflation to it.
Yeah, I mean, we've been evaluating.
So I'm just, that's certainly
So,
something
but
that,
There's truth to some of that is probably, but quite a few of them are probably better numbers.
Well, and I think it's helpful to know, so I appreciate you sharing, but also important to point out that, you know, our intent is not to use this metric to decide anything, right? Like it is one metric that is folded in. And even so, if you look at your spreadsheet, you'll notice that FCI is not listed on there. What's noted is a composite building score, which was our attempt to try to sort of create more of an apples to apples comparison in terms of rating the building. So that's a combination of FCI energy use intensity, so the amount of energy that a building uses in a calendar year, and then air conditioning status. So knowing that buildings with air conditioning are gonna have worse FCI scores because of air conditioning, we wanted to make sure that that was added as a quality to sort of balance that score. But to that point, we know that even that is not a perfect metric, and that a school shouldn't just be judged based on the, you know, pure sort of objective quality of the facility. There's a lot more that goes into it. So, but yeah, really appreciate you flagging that and just the importance of making sure the data is sound that we're operating off of. Yeah, and then just noting that FCI doesn't take into consideration furniture, you know, other equipment, technology, things like that that are in the building. So a lot more on the table. This one is just highlighting outdoor amenities, so not really anything we wanted, you know, no real zingers here, but just noting that this is data we have from when we did site visits earlier on in this project, just wanting to see, you know, what schools are offering tracks versus outdoor classrooms and gardens, and noting that, you know, Southwest actually has more outdoor tracks, more football fields, softball fields, soccer fields than a lot of the other regions. So just taking into consideration how the importance of outdoor amenities as part of the sort of picture of the school. Digging into utilization, so capacity, enrollment over capacity is utilization number. You've probably seen these before. These are on our website, so just sort of grounding that again and just the sort of imbalances that exist where you have a quarter of schools that are over capacity, and then a quarter of schools that are very low, significantly under low utilization. So also breaking that out by region here, so that's that previous chart. You'll see that a lot of the Southwest schools are on that higher end, being over enrolled or sort of close to it, and other regions being shifted the other way. We also broke this out, you know, with separate donut charts just to try to visualize it in a couple different ways. So Southwest over here, you can see half the schools are over 100% capacity, and that sort of table there is pointing to what the definitions of high, very low, low, good are. And then, for example, looking at the central region, you have half the schools that are very low, so under 49% or lower. Yeah.
I just have a question for
Please.
the ones that are over, like, why are we doing that? Why do we just say no?
That's a great question. In terms of like saying no to enrollment.
Yeah,
Sure.
like say like we're full, 'cause like. Some school, I mean, like if you go a little bit over, I can see that, but
Right.
like if you're like 50 kids over, like why?
So I don't think there's an easy answer to it. I think some of the I think motivations that exist too is like more dollars come with more students. So principals might feel, and I just don't want to make bold statements, but they might feel encouraged to have more students because then they have a bigger budget to operate with. And then they can do more with that school building, right? Like invest more in the school or do a number of things. But yeah, Lindy, you want to chime in on this?
Yeah, I think I will make bold statements.
All the way, yeah.
Excuse me. That's kind of the basis of like when we did the enrollment session where we discussed all the potential issues with enrollment, the different mechanisms in place, the fact that there is open enrollment versus non-open enrollment, choosing not to have that, weighing out those pros and cons. Principals generally can make choices about the limit on their students, but they also sometimes receive students that they didn't ask for, even once they said they hit their limit. So, like Nate said, without over explaining, it is complex, but this is part of the consideration of how we start thinking about these decisions in terms of a building's lifespan and where it's at on this index and condition.
And there have been instances too where districts with declining enrollment don't want to lose kids. And so if a parent or family says, I'm only going to this school, right? Like, and then it's, okay, well, we don't want to lose this family. And I'm not saying this is happening here, but just like, these are scenarios in which this kind of stuff comes up and then it kind of snowballs because precedent might be set. And so that's, yeah, to Linda's point, something that came up during enrollment is like, how do we look at enrollment caps as part of a potential strategy to address some of the
Yeah, I mean, I just think maybe it would be an education for some of the parents to like say, like, if you like this school, like,
Right.
you love this school.
Yeah.
And we'll bus them there.
I think it'd be a lot like the transportation, if you took away buses, people would still go to the school that they wanted, and in this case, if
Yeah.
you go, Hamilton is full, they may go to I'll take a door number 2.
Yeah, it
And then
seems like an
There'd be
opportunity.
a good alternate, I would think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as we've said all along, I think overcrowded classrooms and overcrowded buildings are as much like also a big challenge, just like undercrowded buildings, right? Like it is not an
I think it
ideal
would be
situation
more
for
of a
students.
problem because then your kids
Yeah.
are having, like, the kids that are in the undercrowded classrooms are probably having a better classroom experience in some ways because they have more teachers on them.
So that's like a totally, yeah, it's intuitive that that would be the case. A lot of times they're combining grade levels. And so you still have large classrooms and where a teacher might be trying to teach 4th grade and 3rd grade to the same like room of kids. So there are, you know, it is showing up in a myriad of different ways, yeah.
Now, this is the school, not necessarily the classroom, like in the Southwest, when you say 50% of the schools have high,
Mhm.
what is considered, it's like 1 or 2 students over, is it 10 students over, is it 20 students over?
So it's over 101% or higher, so that could be,
So that could be 1
it
or
could
2
be a handful.
students,
It
it
could
could be a family saying, I've got 2 kids here, I need, you know, I need to add my kid.
well, and that's why we try not to look at like a year in isolation, right?
Yeah.
Like, but if a school has a trend of being at 125% for the last
Yeah.
5 years, like that's no longer.
Right.
You know,
No,
this is
right.
a more
not
sort
a-
of chronic issue. So yeah, but to that point, like this is feedback we wanna hear where it's like, okay, I think these metrics should be tweaked to, you know, have these be the boundaries, like. That is very much what we're here for, is like, what do we think are the right sort of boundaries to set? That should help guide those decisions, or how many years should we be looking at, and knowing that COVID kind of screwed up the data for a few years in terms of trying to make an apples to apples comparison, but yeah.
So MPS has for every one of these schools, you have what capacity is, the number of students?
We calculate what the capacity is based on a standard set of metrics across all buildings. So the calculation takes into account, like, you should have a room for art, music, special ed spaces, you should have a space for parent center. If we have a computer lab, so it sets aside those spaces,
Right.
which wouldn't house enrollment.
Right.
And then it assigns 27 or 30, students for all the other classrooms. And then that's what the capacity would be, because now we've got a school with all of the spaces that we would like them to have, art, music, et cetera.
So the way you do it is you have, if school A has 2 classrooms of every grade, right? So I don't know. Oh, let's say 20, let's say school A has 20 classrooms. MPS feels 28 students per classroom is capacity, so that school would have this much? Is that how, I guess, what are you telling the principals? I mean, what is MPS telling the principals that run the school? What's your capacity? When you're giving them funding,
Yeah.
So the principals don't have to jerry-rig things to get a para for every classroom.
So I think that the complicated part of that is we can share what that capacity is with the school.
Uh-huh.
We can say your capacity should be 400.
Right, so you do give them a suggested.
Well,
That's how we track it.
that's how we track it.
Because how are these numbers determined as high? How are you know?
So it's based on, so if you go to these schools where it's high,
Yeah,
what you're gonna find is they don't have a dedicated art room. They don't have a dedicated music room. They don't have a dedicated space for some of the special ed pullouts. They're using very small room over here because they are choosing to enroll more students, and now their art teacher is teaching from a cart.
okay,
The music teacher is teaching from a very small space, not a true classroom.
but you would have given them the right number. You would have assumed that that school is gonna have these, I guess my
Right,
point is
so-
saying, what is, you know, when we're determining, is MPS telling these schools, no, you're high?
I think we.
Or are you,
Necessarily,
or are
Yeah.
you leaving it up to the principals for them to bring in more money?
So it kind of goes, in a lot of directions. At the end of the day, each student is worth a certain dollar amount. And when we had the
Right.
budget presentation however many months ago with Nick Sinram, it's, to pay one teacher's salary, it's a little bit more than 25 students. Just the teacher's salary, not toilet paper, not a copy, not a sheet of paper, not a pencil, just teacher salary. To have a paraprofessional, it's a little bit more than, is it 6? No, 8 students. So that means if I have a K4 classroom, I need 33 kids in that classroom for one teacher and one teacher's aide. 33 kids. That's not looking at what the building can hold or what's good in my
I'm
classroom.
not saying whether
No,
MPS is
I'm
doing it
no, no,
bad or
I'm
good,
just
I'm
saying
just
this is
wondering how
how-
we're getting high.
This is the thought process.
Okay.
I can't have my K4 teacher without a teacher's aide, because if someone has to go to the bathroom, she can't leave the class to walk someone to the bathroom. So I have to have 33 kids in there. So it's gonna be full in certain grade levels in
Right.
order to have the right amount of staff. And so while there might be a number for what my building should be, at the end of the day,
Right.
in practice, I need what's gonna be appropriate for my kids.
But MPS is telling these principals, based on what you have, you're high. So then we're gonna add you to the high.
So,
That's based on the data of how the building is calculated, right? So it's kind of like theory and practice.
Okay,
In
so.
theory, the building holds 450 kids. In
Right.
practice, we might have 580 in there, and yeah, some rooms are tight and some rooms might not be so tight. Or some people may have a cloakroom for a special ed room rather than a little office. And so it's that, and so you have to have enough kids to have a program. You don't have enough kids in a school, like to your point before, if there's not enough kids, you can't afford more art, you can't afford more music. And so in schools where there's very limited enrollment, where you have a smaller class size, you might not have anything else but your teacher in that classroom. And so it's really an inequitable system, the way that it functions right now.
And I agree, and I'm not, if I sounded like I was criticizing MPS, I'm not. I'm just trying to determine, so MPS is saying, I mean, when it says high, what are you basing that high on?
So just to give a very basic example, right, like let's use the number 30 for an easy round number, 30 kids in a class, and let's say a building has 15 classrooms, right? Physical
Right, the
classroom
number.
spaces. So 5 of those spaces are earmarked for a parent center, art,
Right.
music, science, okay, they don't count towards capacity. So then your capacity of that school is 300, right? But that means, and that is how we determine what that capacity number would be. And then we look at enrollment over that. And obviously those numbers are all over the place. And then you have schools who are like, I don't need the parent center, let's add more kids in there. That is real space that could be used for that. Now you just don't have a parent center. And that might be in a corner of a entryway or something. And so stuff just gets kind of moved around. And this is like a very,
So
broad
it is
example,
just
but-
based off of totals.
So the capacity is set, it's, districts do it differently everywhere
Right.
too. Like some districts, it's a priority to have a parent center, others don't care as much. Or haven't prioritized it, I should say. And so really there are many different ways to do it, but yeah, it's complicated, but hopefully that's helpful. And so when you're above that capacity number, when we earmark the things where MPS as a district has decided that music, art, and science, like those spaces need to be set aside and not count towards capacity in an effort to try to guarantee that they have a dedicated space, knowing that it's important, or
Right.
the district has decided so. That's how those numbers sort of ebb and flow.
Okay,
Yeah, hopefully that's helpful in, yeah.
So the question I have, I know one of the topics was safety about the schools. When we're talking about capacity, I know there's like fire hazards and things like that.
Mhm.
And buildings are earmarked with a capacity, a safe capacity. When it comes in terms of enrollment and schools being over, how does that play into those code violations or safety hazards?
That's a really good point. So, and that capacity is different. So that is like a safety fire capacity of like more people, to your point, like this is now a fire hazard.
Yep.
Whereas this is more of like an educational capacity from like, here's how we want our programming to run. So there are usually a few different capacity numbers when you're looking at a building. And it can, just to add to the confusion.
building code capacity you're talking about is
Yeah.
actually even much higher.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, they're saying.
Way
Yes, always
Yeah,
higher,
it's like,
Okay.
always higher.
it's like it's based on square foot, so they're
Right,
saying, oh,
right.
yeah, you can fit 50 kids in this room, they're going, you would never fit 50 kids in
Right,
here."
from a
Good, they got it.
pure safety standpoint, like, yeah, no one,
Yeah.
Right.
hurt in there, but you also won't be doing anything. Yeah.
The main driving factors are the open enrollment, the transportation, the fact that we do not have specific caps. Unless the principals, they can choose to say they're not gonna receive any more students, but that doesn't mean they won't necessarily. And the enrollment folks at the central office have the option to add students at will. So if a family needs kids there, they may send kids there. So there's, right now, what we've learned in the process is that we do not have a set established of cutoffs for this enrollment to happen, and the driving factors that are pushing people to what are considered the popular schools, either by word of mouth, location, family. So there's a couple of different factors that are joining up to compound the issue of the enrollment. Putting parameters down will help, but there'll be impacts from that.
but you don't have, but MPS, the administration doesn't stop anything.
No,
No, there's very few.
no, very few, because we want to accept kids and we don't want to turn people away if we don't have to. But we're realizing through this process that we have to come up with a better way to do that, or the imbalance will continue among the other factors that are contributing.
Yeah, so just to keep moving through this, I wanna make sure we do save time to break out. So this is the last chart, just in terms of scatter plot. So I know these are not always the easiest chart to read, so just one chart kind of explaining how to read it. Basically, the line that we're showing here are just these square footage per student averages that, with the huge caveat that there is no nationally recognized standard for what the correct square footage per student of a school should be. And this is taking into consideration gross square footage, so the entire square footage of the building, but generally some generally accepted good practices, especially regionally in Minnesota and Wisconsin, is like 150 square feet per elementary student, 180 per middle school student, and 230 per high school student. What you're seeing here is that's the trend line. And this is enrollment on the horizontal axis and square footage on the vertical. So the schools that are above the line are ones that have more space for students, right? Like this means they are more than 150 square feet per kid if they're above the line. And if they're below the line, they're less than 150 square feet per kid. And so we've broken this out by school type, and then each color is a different region. So this is elementary schools. So you're seeing the trend line there, 150 kids, and you can see, the majority of them are above that line, which is generally good. And it's also worth noting, some people think that number 150 should be higher, some people think it should be lower, it's a range. So we just wanted to pick sort of a middle ground to sort of highlight this. And you do see there are, of the schools that are below the line, a lot of them are Southwest and Northwest schools. And then the schools that are further over this way have higher enrollment. So, and then this is like a very large school so 200,000 square feet with approximately 400 students in it. I don't know what school that is off the top of my head.
Is it possible to layer the age of the buildings on that? Cause it might be interesting to see if the older buildings are bigger or smaller or where they fall.
Yeah,
If they were built with the 150 in mind or not.
um,
I don't know if age of buildings really matter.
no, yeah, no, I mean, age of,
It might be-
yeah, it's an interesting point, yeah, I'm just trying to think through like how we would get everything onto one chart, but either way, we could spit it out into a new, like, a new. there
My
might be
gut
a
would
better
say
way.
that the newer ones got more square footage, because those are primarily gonna be high schools of North, South, Reagan, Vincent,
These are only elementary schools.
you know, but yeah, it's,
And so just and this might be helpful to see some of the other ones too, so we'll go through them and can jump back, but these are K-8 schools, so there's not a set K-8 number. So we're showing elementary is the black line, middle school number 180 is the blue line. So you'll see again, a pretty sizable pocket of those Southwest schools there. These are K-8s that are, you can assume are more crowded, right? Like less space per student. Whereas over here you have more of those sort of green, blue and oranges from the other regions that have more space and fewer students. Then when you jump to middle schools, knowing that MPS doesn't have many standalone middle schools, these are just those. Really high amounts of space per kid, meaning they're generally have low enrollments with a lot of space. So this kind of highlights back to that utilization piece of middle schools being really low utilization on average, I think 32%. So really drives that point home. And then high schools, which are obviously much larger buildings in general, but a little bit more all over the place. We still see some that are more crowded than others from a space perspective. Others that are really large with a lower student population. It's worth noting that alternative schools like Project Stay are listed on here. The accelerated academies are not. But those are, obviously those would have a lower enrollment by design. So we wouldn't consider them the same way that we would at traditional high school. That's the last sort of regional slide. Any questions on any of that? And this is all in the project folder too, yeah.
If you go back to the last slide, there's a cluster of 2 schools. I can only assume that's north, south, and Vincent. Right there, if you want to give a timestamp.
Sounds good. So now to the fun part. So this is just a reminder, accepting non-closure, equity of voice and everything. Want to make sure grounding in the norms that we set early on. And then just keeping this in mind as we're grouping. So we know we're going to be shifting towards this prioritization piece, right? Like in the next meeting, want to talk about strategies. We want to talk about how to think about prioritizing schools for different strategies, and how do you get schools in the right candidate groups for strategies, and then within that group, like who is a higher priority than who else from the school perspective. So I'm gonna start in the middle and work backwards, but this is the activity. So we have game boards in the back, and we'll sort of break them out here. And we've got, I think, 20 cards and some blank cards as well that have different facility considerations. So these are specific to the building. We've done a similar activity before where we had programming considerations like after school programming or specialty programming, and there's a little bit more, again, apples to oranges. So we really wanted to focus on facilities for this meeting and try to understand, what those priorities are. And then going up to that first question is like, how does this inform realistic goal setting for the district for the next 10 years? Thinking about like in the year 2035, where do we want MPS schools to be from a facilities perspective and in a pragmatic sense? Like what are reasonable expectations? And then the last but not least, we always want to make sure we plant the seed that if you're noticing that like for the enrollment cap situation, right? Like it's going to be hard to stop over enrolling schools if we are set up to allow that to happen or encourage it. So if there are other things in the facilities realm, I know one that's come up is like the state statute about what MPS has to do with its buildings. Those are things we want to just get your thoughts on as well. So because we are a smaller group, we'd love to just do 2 groups. We can do one of 4 and one of 3. If y'all want to take
we'll
your
scoot over.
Go to the room or?
I think, like, we did okay in the same room last time, and if y'all are good with it, I know voices, like, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe if we move you guys over. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
Mohammed's coming to the mountain.
So.
It's some cup blue, it's the.
And then when we go.
So we just stacked it all over there.
I did not talk about that. I said, no, no, no rules.
So like, but similar.
Oh, that's
No,
people.
no, so what?
Oh, we thought it, okay, so we thought that those actually extra classrooms were a subcategory of the appropriately sized building. You're gonna size the classrooms.
And if you're building a building with a specialty, then it's gonna have what that specialty needs. If it's efficient and optimal. So it's kind of subcategories
Yeah,
of that one.
we thought it meant all the same thing.
And so like we combined the spaces supporting for a program, because that sounded more like middle school, high school with CTE or media production. And then the specialty rooms for art, music, gym as an elementary school. That way we're covering both. And then parking, we put less because we focus more on what kids would need,
Yeah.
more kid-based.
How did y'all decide about the energy efficiency?
Yeah, that was.
That was one that I think was
Well,
higher.
I know, what I thought is there's so many old buildings, it will cost so much that I don't think you're gonna get to it. I mean, that's how I feel.
I kind of raised a question to him and I kind of want to bring it up to everyone. At what point does MPS say this building is worth investing in versus this building needs to be laid to rest and needs to build?
I think that's a great question. I don't know
Yeah.
that we have a perfect answer to that.
No, and I
Yeah.
completely
Good
understand. Or like,
guidance.
or even just like, okay, we can merge some schools and how do we like let go of buildings that no longer, you know, are needed in our pool of real estate? Where does that, when does that decision gets made? Who makes that decision? Is it a committee? Is it a person? Who oversees the real
That's the
estate?
process we're in right now. is that-
Yeah, this is real.
It's pretty much up
This
to
is
the
it.
board
This is,
before,
it
I
is
mean,
based on policy. Our policy outlines what criteria a building should be retired and when, but it is after all of this. Well, it's a guideline, but after all of this, it usually calls for these types of things to happen. So once we've met and been able to kind of go through our bucket lists and look at the buildings, look at the priorities, look at the goals, you know, overlay them, shuffle them around, decide, okay, this looks the best way. Those buildings that fell in the low end of the bucket list based on just their condition alone architecturally, if there are no other priorities lifting them out of that bucket, they'll likely stay in that bucket. And that will support what the policy is already written about when a building should retire.
The thing that drove me nuts when I worked at MPS, there was a phrase I heard so many times I wanted to smash my head into a concrete block wall. Where we're gonna decide that on a case by case basis, over and over. And they do things like, we think we're gonna close Carlton, so they tell facilities, don't spend money on Carlton because we're gonna close it. And then 10 years later, they may finally close it, but in the meantime, so I think this is good to get a structure on it. But I'd at least advocate, take out this whim of, it's a case by case, or it depends if the board member objects more loudly than the other board member. It's like, you need to get something more mathematical in place, where at this point, you pull the plug.
We're looking at it systematically.
And even when you pull the plug, like we built Bethune Academy, and we still had 37th Street was open for what, 20 years?
Well, we just couldn't get rid of it.
Well, we couldn't get rid of it, but in the meantime, we kept heating it.
Yeah.
This is what, so for 20 years, we're heating a closed building.
I just wanna
Yeah.
speak to your point, like, that is what we're trying to do, right? Like, is
Yeah.
develop that system of evaluation of buildings. But we know that it's also not just the physical building that should be the sole deciding factor. However, we wanna be able to come up with a process that you can explain when the community member says why this school got X and why that school got Y. That you can say, here's what. Here are the processes we went through, here are the metrics that sort of landed it in the group that it was in, and here's why and how that school ended up receiving that treatment in whatever form or fashion.
And then to speak to your question about like how and why it closes, I think you could probably go back in board proceedings and see just how, and it was even with what we presented last October, November, how challenging and how people took it to heart that you're closing my school, the school that my grandchildren, my mother and I all went to school, so there's a lot of attachment to the building, which is hard, yeah.
Right, and just kind of another segue is, I know a lot of these buildings, like they're older, they need a lot of work, and I think the biggest problem is that right now MPS doesn't have the funding to remodel, put in the money needed. But can that be opened up to community, to development, to city for like housing, people who do have the money maybe to come in and develop that space to be used for something that can maybe work in assistance? You know, with MPS, like,
We think that's part of what we
So-
say here is part of that proposal.
That state statute, that is this, one of the links in the supplementary resources on the one pager from this one,
Right.
highlights the restrictions that MPS has in terms of what it can do with its buildings. So even after a school is closed, it is not, are steps that are required before it can sell a building, repurpose a building, it has to make it available to other educational,
Like primarily charter
We need to
schools.
change that.
like,
Yeah.
That's
so
gonna
the-
have
so
to
when
make
you
a
think about
bold-
policy
I'm gonna make
changes
the
like
bold
that's a big
statement.
one.
That is something that needs to
State
change.
law.
Yeah, that is the policy that needs to change, because it is.
It's a state law that applies to all Class A schools, which is.
Only
just
us.
MPS.
Oh, it's a
Is that the
state
same
law.
thing for lots
Yeah.
as well?
What was that?
Is that the same for like
Not
MPS
in
lots, that maybe it doesn't
Right,
have to
but
be
it has to
one
start
is-
somewhere.
Yeah, we just have a hand, no, it actually
Even if
only
it's not
refers to the sites with buildings on them.
And it's part of
Yeah.
the size of our district is over 50,000. And we're like the only district that is held to that,
Right,
so which makes it very unfair.
yeah.
So, you
We
know,
signed up for it.
yeah, but this is just another add point to thinking about the broad spectrum of what we'll ultimately end up proposing based on all of the data that we collected, is that this is a long range plan. So something that we would want to change in legislation, which I mean, in policy like that statewide, would be take a longer run of work to get that changed. So we prioritize based on the span of time it might take to do certain things at certain locations where that would be an impact. So maybe the school where it might be that it's slower on the bucket list and maybe it should be closed down. But if we see overrides of community or education or program opportunities that enough people say this is a strong reason to keep this on the map or the land or whatever it is, then maybe that one gets pushed back into the longer part of the range plan. And we push another one forward while we work that out. So it doesn't, I don't think that we have to completely limit ourselves in our thinking. We have time also to apply to this that will help us say, maybe this isn't a right now decision, maybe it's a mid-range decision or a long-range decision. That doesn't mean we don't close
Your
buildings.
question, go
You
ahead.
said that there was a school that you couldn't get rid of.
Yeah.
What were the factors that made it difficult to get rid of that school?
I wanna say, and again, I don't have a specific
Right.
one, but normally it was, families would come out of the woodwork and say, you know, you don't close my school, you know, we love our school, and even though enrollment at the school may not be very good, we ran into this when we merged a couple of schools and, you know, ended up merging them, and so it's always very challenging because it's hard to see beyond, like, I think it's really difficult to see beyond like right now what's impacting my child versus maybe looking beyond, you know, what could be. So, and maybe we weren't offering good options for what could be.
Yeah.
So maybe that was the missing part of the
Yeah, you
equation.
have to
I
have.
feel like some of those didn't have a specialty. Like one, like I'm thinking one of the closures, I don't remember who all it was, had a very like targeted special needs population. And then the other school closed, and I don't know if they fit into that building or they fit into the other one, but it wasn't like a matching program or something like,
Right.
hey, we're gonna put you guys together and make this brand new woo-hoo, whatever
Yeah.
specialty. It was just, nope, we're taking two neighborhood schools and smushing it.
Right, so these are lessons that we can learn from, and, you know, so maybe that's part of what we need to think about and we can help us think about so that we get better results.
And less pushback, because if you're offering something better for something that you're taking away, even if it might take longer to get there, then it might make more sense. So let's say that option for taking that building away is a new shiny building, it's gonna take us 5 years to get the money. So that one may not be necessarily on the closing block today, but in 2 years it might close, and then 2 years later, that new one's gonna be built. So, you know, that's kind of getting that long range thing, and at that point, the people who are crying about the building, no offense to anybody crying about the building, but they're gone, and we're talking about a new set of families, new set of, even a change in neighborhood potentially of who's in there, you know, what demographic changes.
So I know we're over time. We don't have anything critical to get to on here, other than we'll get the post survey sent out with the link. If you want to think about those questions, that would be helpful to ask community members as part of the Insights Forum. We'd love to have you push those out. Some of the other steering committee members, yeah.
When you were 29 people are the only people that answered your community questions? Only 29 people totally? Out of how many thousands of?
Well, and we're also like, we want to
Can we-
encourage you all
Can
to,
we push out a text? Yeah.
we have,
Can't
well,
we just
yeah.
send out a text saying, hey,
They're
we're
encouraging that.
facilities, they need, you know, well, I can't do it, I can ask the principals. Is there, okay, so then,
There's a
I
flyer
don't
that
mind
we
sending,
produced that has the QR code for the survey, so we. and-
no, that's not my question.
Yes.
How are you gonna get to these people? How am I gonna get to these people? Is there a way that we can get the parent coordinators on some of these lists so I can send an email to the parent
You
coordinators?
can email at will, like, please.
I don't have that.
She don't have.
I don't have MPS stuff.
I know, but I'm saying,
No,
like,
you can just put on Facebook, you know, send it out to your,
but
I don't have any, what did you guys list as your- That's where, but.
so, but it's, I don't want to say, like, if you know a principal name, if you're gonna vote to print that, their staff members.
That's
I don't
my
think to put it all by you, it's just like,
No, that's
we
not
wanna
my
work
question.
with committee members, like,
That's not my question.
okay.
Can I get the name of every principal on my Southwest thing? Hey, you have it. I don't. So you have the name of every principal at every one of the schools.
There's 6 regional superintendents. In the Southwest, and she can send it out to all the.
Yeah.
The gal that was there.
Yeah,
Alright.
and so, yeah, it just, it tends to have, her email is on our contact list for the.
Am I gonna do meeting? I can send that from Jane.
Well, and it needs a lot more. when it's people helping push yeah.
Oh God, it's listening.
No, I agree. So I'll send you the contact list of people who do it on their phone.
I think so, yeah.
Bless you, my child.
That doesn't fit again, but okay, doesn't make that kind of. Yeah, just, you can just stack them for me and I'll.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have one way where I started to check it out.
Well, and maybe the question there is like, can she provide that? Like, I don't have the things either, and I know that, you know, it's not my place to chase them down.
Thank you, Marshall.
Hey, no problem.
Your,
You
you should, send in your.
I asked him if, yeah, he's like, I mean, instead of somebody having to go off of this and like, retype what they're hearing, yeah, I asked him, do you want me to just send you the actual Google thing that's like.
But I saw only 2 people and I was
Flip
probably.
it over there, cause I mean, I went back and forth and just was, I mean, I came up with a bunch of those things. I guess one of the other things I didn't I mean, most of this was on,
More of like the-
on,
right, like we're so
you had
lucky.
most of the stuff that I come up with. There were some more specific things, you know, which, yeah, it'd be great if there was like a green wall or this or that, or, you know, I mean, the importance of it, okay, well, probably not, to me, it's not like ADA stuff. I still am very surprised that there's any school in our system that, okay, maybe it doesn't have an elevator, I guess, or something, but that there's schools in our.
Even the ones that are ADA accessible,
Right.
that's because they did a
And that's what we're
50-foot
trying to do.
ramp,
We know that.
right?
Right,
So
right.
there's schools that exist
But-
like that, so there's
Yeah.
freakiness, and then like, so acoustic,
You know.
acoustic design, so the newest edition of the International Building Codes that is yet to be adopted by the state of Wisconsin, actually addresses that for educational environments
Sure.
as a necessity. So,
Right, right.
that's something that I'm dealing with, so I actually got the walk-off carpet, and it's all right off the.
Oh, okay, sure.
Because of the acoustic.
Oh, yeah,
You can
yeah.
walk in